Hello everyone, my name is Jackie Cortez and today I want to talk to you about the privatization of prisons. So before I start, I want to talk about Orange is the New Black. Has anybody here seen the series? Okay, so for those of you that have, you are familiar with the term privatization. But for those of you who haven't, I would like to define privatization as, in the context of this speech, as the process in which the government hires a third party to handle or take over a certain area. In this case, the government hires private companies to build, fund, and operate prisons. The privatization of prisons is a growing and in many cases profitable process. Currently, the Corrections Corporation of America, the GEO Group, and MTI are the biggest for-profit prison organizations. In 2014, the CCA and GEO Group made a combined revenue of $3.3 billion. My main proposition for today's speech is that the privatization of prisons is counterproductive. This is because private prisons fail in decreasing crime rates, have subpar conditions, and fail to be cost-effective. My first point is that the privatization of prisons fail in decreasing crime rates. One of the many supposed benefits of privatization is supposed to be increased capacity. Increased facility means increased housing, which means more criminals can be incarcerated. However, a study by the NYU Brennan Center for Justice found that since 2000, the effect of the crime rate on increasing incarceration has been essentially zero. This shows that though prisons have profit incentives, there are no effects on the crime rates. Another piece of evidence I would like to share is that the Minnesota Department of Corrections led a study in 2013 regarding recidivism. Recidivism is simply the tendency of a criminal to reoffend or commit another crime. The study found that the results showed that the offenders who had been incarcerated in a private prison had a greater hazard of recidivism in all 20 models. The evidence presented in this study suggests that the private prisons are not more effective in reducing recidivism, which may be attributable to fewer visitation and rehabilitative program opportunities for offenders incarcerated at private facilities. These quotes show that there are other factors to consider when thinking about the decreasing crime rates. Social, economic, and environmental factors also have an effect. These quotes highlight that privatization does not contribute to the decreasing crime rates. I'd like to move on to the second point, which is that the privatization of prisons has led to a decrease in the conditions of the facilities. In an official study between private and public prisons, the Office of the Inspector General reported that per capita, privately run facilities had more contraband, assaults, lockdowns, and complaints about conditions. This quote from a direct government source illustrates that the disparities in the conditions between public and private prisons. According to the Associated Press, an Idaho Correctional Center run by CCA has been cited many times as denying prisoners medical treatment to cover up assaults. Reports show many instances of abuse and negligence, such as the case of Mr. Hani Elabad. Mr. Elabad was assaulted violently for an elongated period of time while correctional officers looked on. He obtained brain damage from the beating. It is instances like these that earned the Idaho facility the nickname of Gladiator School, as inmates are forced to suffer through such violence. According to Mother Jones, an investigative journal, in another private prison, Mr. Ba, a Guinean immigrant, suffered at the hands of correctional officers as well. Mr. Ba, 52, had been left in an isolation cell without treatment for more than 13 hours before an ambulance was called. After receiving medical care, Mr. Ba's managers continued to debate the most cost-effective course of action. Unfortunately, Mr. Ba died not long after this. These examples serve as evidence as the lack of oversight and the subpar conditions of the private prisons. I would like to move on to my third and final point, which is the privatization fails to be cost-effective. The Office of the Inspector General also reported that the biggest way in which costs were cut were through staffing. Privately run facilities were hiring less workers and paying them less as well. This is not cost-effective if there are other social costs. One thing is for sure though. The authors of the paper, The Economics of Private Prisons, a paper for the policy analysis organization, the Hamilton Project, writes, The Government Accountability Office has concluded multiple times that the data are not sufficient to definitively claim that either type of prison is more cost-effective. In conclusion, I have shown that the privatization of prisons fails in decreasing crime rates, decreases the condition of the facilities, and fails to be cost-effective, with much of the evidence coming from the government itself. I hope you can understand and agree that the privatization of prisons is counterproductive. Thank you.
All right, in the introduction, the structural stuff is all solid. The background is fine. You tell us what the proposition is. It's very clearly labeled, and I think it's phrased appropriately. The contents are previewed. The secondary points are presented as declarative sentences. There's a numerical signpost on each of them, so it's going to be easy to follow the argument as you present it. I think you could maybe do a little bit more about the controversy on the subject, but it wasn't really problematic, and I like the information that you had that talked about the three private groups and how much money they're making currently in regard to that. When you get to the body of the speech, the signposts on the secondary claims, like I said, are clear and everything is labeled pretty directly. There's an explanation on most of the points. Like on the first point, you mentioned recidivism, and there was some statistical information about that. The Minnesota study, for instance, I thought was the one that was probably the strongest on this particular point. The first piece of information on the effect that it has on crime, that seems like a very conclusionary statement from the source that you're saying, the New York University Center for Study of Justice, or whatever the organization was. It says it basically had zero effect. That's a conclusion, but it doesn't explain to me how they reached that conclusion. The Minnesota information, though, does suggest that they did a comparison between the prisons, and they saw what the difference was in the recidivism rate. And then there was also a little bit of an explanation as to why that existed. That's a place where I think you could have used some information to show that there were fewer rehabilitation programs or lack of access to the kinds of things that would make it easier for people to transition to life outside of prison. That's something that I think would have added to your argument and made it a little stronger on that particular point. On the second point, the conditions of the prisons, you're very dependent on examples here. They're good examples. The example of the one inmate at the Idaho prison, I think, certainly sounds depressing. And then there's another example that's at another place where somebody got hurt, they're left in isolation, the treatment took a long while, and they died. That's also a depressing example. The frequency with which that happens, how typical it is, and the difference between the private prisons and the regular prisons, that needs to be emphasized a little bit more. You had a kind of a generic piece of information at the beginning that suggested that per capita, all these things are higher in the private prisons. But there are like 3 or 4 categories that you list there, and they're not all assaults. Some of them have to do with lockdowns and other kinds of disruptive behavior, and then equating them with the things that you're talking about here, that's a little bit of an inferential leap that needs some more information on it. The argument about the cost issue and whether or not it saves money, it's kind of strange because the GAO study that you cite basically comes down and say we can't tell one way or the other. So we don't really have any data that suggests that it costs more. The explanation that you have is that they have less staff and they pay less, which I'm sure is one of the ways in which they reduce costs. What we need is information that says that means that that might be the source of the problems that you're talking about on the first and the second point, especially the second point. But that doesn't necessarily mean that that there's a higher cost as a consequence. That's counterintuitive. The question about what the GAO looked at, what their information was, it needs to be a little bit more specific. It's kind of a generic quote on this, And like I said, it doesn't go either direction. So as proof of your point, I think that's a little problematic. It's nicely presented, maybe a little more reading than you want, but it's very clear. I know what all the claims are. I can see how all your evidence is being related to the points that you're presenting. So from an argumentative point of view, I think you're doing a good job. All right, thank you.